Welcome everyone to episode number 15 of the Intersection 4 podcast. You have your usual three guests here. We have Hamis, the investor, we have Brendan, the founder, and you have me, the philosopher. And today I'm very excited. Today is, I guess, a special day for me because we were able to finally convince Hamis and Brendan to discuss something special about AI that I'm particularly fond of, that I always keep bringing up in some of the previous discussions that we've had, but we never really get enough time to discuss it fully, which is frankly just like the philosophy of AI. We're going to get into more details around how it's going to impact the job market, society, how it's going to impact production and the labor force and humanity as a whole. The matrix come in and whatever our imagination takes us. So pretty stoked for today's episode. I don't know if you can see it on the whiteboard here behind me, but I wrote philosophy just to celebrate the occasion. But okay, let's jump right in. First question on the table is going to be straight to the point. We're going to dive right in. No introductions, no nothing. What's going to happen with the job market with this huge uptake in AI with agents and so on? Let's start with Brendan, and from there we go.
I'll kick it directly to Hamiz. I want to save my take first.
I feel like it's going to be a hot take, and that's what we love here. Yeah, I think I keep going back and forth. If I'm honest, I keep going back and forth because I see some applications where it feels much closer, much more disruptive. I see others where it's still in its early stages, and I always try to meet people who frankly, have been through these types of very large scale human impact from technologies before, and try to understand like whether this feels very similar or very different than before. And it sounds like it seems very similar. It sounds like everyone was a little confused, and you had like I think two camps. The people who were closest to the technology, even within them, you had camps of people who thought it was a little bit over. There was too much concern or too little concern about this. But the thing that has always caught my attention is the people who seem to be most technically uh, involved are also the ones who seem to be the most concerned. But then I get confused because Brendan comes on and has like completely opposite, opinion. So which I love, right? It makes me like really think about it. So I'm going to say I'm not really sure what the impact is, and I go back and forth. And today I think will help me kind of put some of those thoughts into more clearer direction.
Let me maybe frame it in a different way before we get your thoughts here, Brendan. When you think about AI and its impact in the job market, multiple people talk about multiple outcomes across multiple time frames, and I think that's a really important piece here. It's like, what is the time frame impact in the short term and in the long term? So I'm going to frame the question that way. So what we have right now, I would say, is already impacting the job market in a pretty significant way and impacting society in a pretty significant way. But we're going to have freaking, I don't know, 20 years on the line, it's going to look completely different. It's going to be even more impactful. So I want to divide it that way. In the short term, and short term, I'm defining 1 to 3 years, what's the impact, and what's the impact over the long term, and long term I'm defining, say, 20 plus years.
Yeah, I'll start with the short term. I think obviously we've found that the knowledge worker industry is the most like readily impacted, and then within that there is like a set of workflows or use cases that are very clear. This was the chat GPT, help me write an essay, help me form a blog post, get some marketing content, help me write this email. I think we've really saturated this work, and we've reached a point where most people who are going to be using technology are using these products for that work today. It's pretty straightforward. I will say I'd say majority of the work though is a human using an AI tool, chain, agent, chatbot to get some answer, and then the human is going out and like physically representing that piece of work in the real world. I think I don't have a strong opinion on if it will or won't happen immediately, but I think the next wave is the agent, these like AI systems taking action on behalf of the human equivalent. So instead of you going and asking a question, getting an answer, going to another system, asking a question, getting an answer, these systems are operating on their own. There's a lot of physical limitations that actually prevent this. The web is a great example of one where it's actually quite hard for a piece of technology to use the web. The web is built historically for humans. So if you think of like what a website is, it's a HTML, CSS, JavaScript rendered on a Chrome browser on a MacBook computer. And by the time it reaches you as a user, there's so many layers that this thing has gone through just to make a human visually see what's happening. And there's a lot of like fancy tech around emulating that, so these AI systems can view these browsers. But it's not a clear cut problem. The whole internet doesn't have an API behind it. So I would say, to your point, summarizing maybe the short term, it still feels like there's a lot of human in the loop. And there's no clear winner of how that's going to completely, disembark. But in the long term, we'll find ways to, create that API for the internet. And then the API for the physical world probably comes thereafter, which is really, an entirely different problem set. The one that I like to always compare is, a lot of people think of self-driving from the coast as like AI for the physical world. I have a bunch of friends from the Midwest that are John Deere employees, and their AI systems are equally as kind of impressive, but going to go under the radar. So there's a lot of these like physical manifestations of these systems that we don't even hear right now because software is so loud.
That's interesting because the assumption is if it's on the internet, it's accessible digitally, right? And it is accessible digitally, but it's laid out in a format where it's accessible by humans, right? So that's even an assumption that I think I make, is that as long as the information is accessible through a computer without a human's interaction, a computer can access that too. So that's definitely a part of my assumption.
Let
It's
me
interesting.
let me make a comment here. So I think it's interesting the way that we're framing this in the short versus the long term. And I chose an arbitrary date or time frame to define that, but I think the short and the long term could actually have a very objective division here. And I think that division is going to be physical manifestations of AI. Not just self driving, but just anything in the field of robotics, anything in which an agent is acting in the real world physically. Because if you think about it, some of the areas of knowledge work that have been impacted today are many of those areas that are heavily dependent on interacting with tools on the web. And I think that area is going to continue to get eroded over time. So first, let's say there were copywriters.
Well, a lot of it's
Afterwards,
actually
there's
offline. The first version was offline completely. There was no internet, and then it was, you're right, online after that.
so yeah. So when you get online, some of those areas are getting eroded over time. So you have copywriters, you have blog posts, you have now like repetitive workflows. I mean, software engineering, right? Which everybody thought for several years is always going to be protected from AI and automation. Again, if you're doing everything virtually online, an AI model can do it. I think the really big gap is going to come again in robotics because you see robots right now; they're really amazing, but there's a gap right now in embodied AI, in getting models to operate robots, to replicate fine human motions, to be able
Yep.
to lift boxes, to be able to paint. And I think as we close that gap is when we're going to start seeing the long term playing in, and a lot of the other fields that we thought were safe for now, like construction and so on, and farming or whatever, are gonna get completely eroded away by automation.
Yeah.
Do
There's
you feel, Brendan, that it's happening where the hardware is getting pushed even faster now because the software is more capable? Because at least to me, maybe I'm paying more attention to it. It feels like robotics is advancing faster and faster. Maybe it just feels like that. I don't know.
You know what's the thing too?
Yeah.
Before you comment, Brendan, let me just make
yeah.
a quick comment here. I think it's not just robotics per se. Like it's not just the robotics part that is tricky. The tricky part is agency on a robot. Like robotics, I also agree that robotics is advancing very quickly, and I think a lot of the robots today are getting really amazing. But from there, of grabbing a piece of hardware that can move in certain directions that are very objective, to actually having agency via some model that is controlling the robot, I think there's a big gap there that we still need to close.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, we talked about this with a friend a couple weeks ago. I think it's probably both. Like they've gotten there's a feels like it's happening faster, and it also feels like they're getting more publicity than historically they've gotten compared to software.
Hmm.
Um, it reminds me of also the way that they're currently training these embodied AI systems. So it's very similar to what Tesla went through 3 years ago, where they went from like a semi-rule based, semi-neural network based approach of perception, actuation. So hey, perceive the world, make a decision, sometimes rule based, and then perform an action, slow down, turn. They're now, I think, as of last year or two, announced that they're fully end to end neural network. So there's no, rule. There's no if stop sign, turn right, slow
Hmm.
down. It's fully connected. I think there's a similar thing happening in embodied robotics where they've historically had these kind of like piecewise systems that they've controlled. Um, uh, PID loops, I think they're typically called. Um, Nowadays that they're using these vision systems to reason about the world, and then they're hooking into their historically pretty strong PID loops. So it's like an LLM multimodal vision system taking the reasoning and then spitting out to what historically is like an API or some method to control the arm. So this is kind of what Tesla was 3 years ago with like these in between systems. And now that a lot of people are talking about these end to end trained um, embodied robotics, which
Hmm.
we probably talked about this last week, and I might be repeating myself, but that's actually one of the biggest reasons why people train or build these robotic systems to look like humans, is because it's the easiest way to build training data, because you have a lot
Hmm.
of video of
Yeah,
humans, and by
exactly.
having a human robot, they're able to use the training data of video in post detection.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
let me double click there. I think because I've been deep into the world of robotics data for the last couple of weeks for some other stuff, but um, it's really interesting that one of the things that I've noticed is the challenge in embodied AI is not necessarily a hardware challenge or a software challenge. It's actually a data challenge. There's a lot of video data, but there's
Yep.
very little data around how does your hand accelerate when you're brushing your teeth? How
Yeah.
does your fine motions actually happen when you're cooking or when you paint something, right? And I actually run into this. Let me just share real quick. I run into this tweet the other day that I think is really fascinating. So basically, somebody on some blog post posted this. Person's working at OpenAI. They've trained a lot of models, and basically, it's becoming awfully clear that these models are just a true approximation of the data set. So, whatever the data is, the model just turns out to be a great approximation. All the other hyperparameters and all the other um, stuff around the model are just ways that you approximate closer to the data itself. So it's almost like I've started to say this recently: is the data is the AI, and the AI is the data, and
Yeah.
all the other is just approximations. But that's not there yet for robotics. Like there's no again, there's a data gap right now for robotics, and I think
Hmm.
that's probably what's keeping us from doing that big jump.
And how do you even fill that gap? Right? Like, is it more video data? Is it plugging into somebody's neural system to understand how things accelerate when they think about moving their hand? Right? Like, how do you get more data, Brendan, on like how our bodies react to what we're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the game, right? That's who
Hmm.
wins. I think if you think about it, actually, OpenAI made this attempt and they failed. A lot of people sometimes forget before the LLMs got big, there was the OpenAI gym simulations. They spent a good 3 years putting out simulation-based reinforcement learning approaches to robotics in these types of systems, and they came out in the end and said, we failed because there's a data problem, and reinforcement learning was supposed to be the solution. Reinforcement learning being you don't need data as long as you can do self play, and enough self play, which is reinforcement learning in effect, allows you to create that data. Um, it wasn't there. Will it
Hmm.
exist now under like a better modeling approach potentially? But it's probably more likely that we'll find that recording enough people in supply chain warehouses doing pose detection and then trying to recreate that in a simulation and training data like so will probably yield better results. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's
Yeah, we've been
who
speaking
knows.
to a number of companies like that, and they're already collecting that data. And I don't know if so their solution was your insurance premiums fluctuate depending on the way that your workers are interacting with their environment, right? So if their posture is very good, getting down and picking something up, and they find that on average, the entire factory is, really good posture, then the chances they get hurt are lower, so your insurance premium goes down, right? So it sounds like an interesting concept, but I was thinking the whole time they were pitching, I was like, as long as you collect the data, right? As long as you collect this data, like your data is probably going to be worth a lot more than, I don't know if you can make this business model work, but your data is going to be worth a lot more. So like I think a lot of companies like in the past they would be able to monetize their user base, and I think
You
now
can
they'll be
monetize
able to
your
monetize your data. Like you can fail as a business, but if you collect 1 million hours of
100%.
any
That's
site
that's
of
so true. That's so true.
video or text or whatever, and it's clean and ready to train, like
100%.
OpenAI and Facebook are just going to go buy 100 million here, 10 million here, just buy these data sets.
Google.
Or
I
maybe
think
it's
Google's
that's
got a
a
Google.
good
good.
data set. Then think about
Yeah,
Google.
yeah.
It had 100,000 of the best developers in the world. That's a beautiful data set to train. The next Google version of Devin, the
I mean,
AI
you
engineer.
also even saw the deal, right, that Google did with Reddit, where Google bought a bunch of data for training from Reddit for like $60 million. That was a huge deal that happened. So, um,
Which makes sense
yeah,
because
and
it's a pre-moderated data set. I think this is the issue. You can get a lot of data, but everyone's finding data that's high quality is more important. That's Llama 3 was basically kind of regurgitating what we're talking about here, which is high quality data wins data versus data scale majority of the time.
So should
yeah,
people be starting companies that specifically just focus, like the entire product is, I don't care what happens, like I'm just here to collect as much data. Like I'll lose money on collecting data as a business model because I'll make it the same way that they used to lose money to collect users, right? Because on the back end, the user base was worth something. So do you start like losing money on collecting data because on the back end it's worth something?
here's what I'm gonna say on that. I think the answer there, you guys are gonna laugh, and I won't be able to elaborate too much, but the answer there is crypto. The answer there is crypto and its decentralization, genuinely, because data wants to be free. And I think the model of data collection right now that is fully closed and isolated and in silos is not going to get us where we want to get, specifically when it comes to robotics data. Like one of the things that is really interesting is when we're talking about robotics, there was a paper that came out a little bit ago. Let me share it real quick here. Um, it's called Grain by Manual Manipulation with Low Cost Hardware. Really interesting paper. I read through a little bit of the paper. I saw it on a video that I thought it was fascinating. Generally, what they try to do was they they grabbed thongs, literally kitchen thongs, and they started recording a bunch of video of thongs grabbing other things because a lot of the ways that robots interact with the world is via thongs. Because not every robot for every use case is going to be a humanoid. You actually see here some videos of robots trying to interact and moving things with a pair of thongs, and literally just going about their task. Or even humans, you don't even need the entire thing. You just need like the pair of thumbs with a camera, and then just grab things and move them around to collect some of these data sets. But here's where it gets interesting, though. This is not like this is not a traditional business model for any company to say, hey, we're gonna start up freaking thongs company that's gonna come preloaded with a camera for people to go and record data. This is the perfect use case for decentralized incentives. This is a perfect use case for building a model or a system that is simple enough that enables anybody to go about their day and collect data in any bespoke way. A really good example of this model is HiveMapper. I think HiveMapper is a fantastic company. I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard of HiveMapper. Maybe
Yeah, no,
Brendan.
I know them. Yeah, I know them quite well. Yeah.
Yeah, so for those who are not aware, HiveMapper is basically a decentralized mapping company, and they collected a lot of data in a decentralized fashion, and now they are moving also into AI. Basically, what they do is they sell dash cams um, that basically let you connect the dash cam to your dashboard in your car, and as you drive around, you record the data. And now they have a bunch of decentralized data. Anybody who submitted data directly is compensated for the data that they submitted. So I think there's a really interesting use case, and I'm getting pretty bullish on
mm, mm,
some of the
mm.
ways that data can be incentivized and data collection can be incentivized using new
So
means and
all the jobs
individuals.
that we lose, Brendan, do they just get replaced by people working on collecting data to train the models?
I don't know. Probably not. But like here's another interesting data collection one that like maybe this does turn into that is VR or AR. Given if you were to be like, what gave me the idea was actually the video you just showed, right? Like that was like some fisheye of this system trying to like grab something. That to me is almost what the current Meta goggles and Vision Pro
Mm,
is. There's some like simulation in your training data is like picking something up, moving something. That's got to be a pretty strong data feed for just sitting at a desk and being able to train a robotic system to go grab, move, do the dishes, fold laundry. I think that's one of the most interesting data sets. And if you have a bunch of people like working remote, effectively doing that, maybe that's the next layer
mhm,
of like humans teaching systems.
mhm. Yeah, like
So
there's already like we were talking about last time, right? There's already like hundreds and thousands of humans that sit and look at two code snippets and say that one's a better code snippet, right? And that's the new job, and it probably improves their quality of life, right? And they're able
Yep.
to do it remote, like driving, like sitting on a train, they can, be participating in this
I
economy.
hope they're not doing that.
Uh,
They're not doing that while they're
yeah,
driving. That
not
wouldn't
not
be
not driving.
that wouldn't be a good idea.
Let's say
uh,
it's self-driving. They're not
Self
driving.
driving,
yeah,
yeah, self
no,
driving.
yeah, that's
Um,
right.
so it's actually interesting because I have a buddy of mine who he recently got laid off from his gig, and he's working for a company that is doing data annotation, doing exactly what you're talking about, Hummus. And he was telling me that he felt, I mean, it was good money, like you work whenever you want, and it's like you make some money, whatever. But he was telling me that there was something weird to him about training the thing that's gonna take his job away. And I think there's a lot of truth to this. To your point of do all of the to your point, and back to the philosophical discussion of do all of the jobs that we're gonna um, automate or replace get replaced by the people who own by the people who are training these models? I don't think so. I think there's a escape velocity in which these models get good enough, and then pretty much we see like a massive shift in the labor market. But I think this is really important and this matters a lot because we're realizing more and more that the AI is the data is AI. But I think this matters, and by this I mean this way of collecting data from multiple individuals, because whoever owns the data owns the AI. If that's the most valuable piece of the AI stack, whoever owns the data owns the AI. And if we're going to start talking about distributing the benefits of AI fairly across humanity, I think it's really important to to take that into account and say, hey, the data that people are creating in their daily lives should be owned by them, and whenever it's used to train models and becomes extremely valuable because of a very powerful model, they should be compensated for that. They should own the model. And I think I'm getting excited about AI ownership and model ownership via data ownership. I think that's the path that I see
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah, it's funny.
And
That's
that's
like
where the crypto stuff comes in, Brendan. Like it kind of it's weird, but it kind of is like the perfect fit for a problem like that, where you can incentivize, global workforces to provide the data, but you can also incentivize the interaction between the different players to utilize it, monetize it, and I can't think of like a better kind of economic and security structure than blockchains to coordinate all of that all around the world.
yeah. You also have like the proof of source. I don't know what the right word is, where you can say
Hmm.
majority of the system's training the net new data into the system needs to be human generated, because if you're throwing an AI
Hmm.
generated output into an AI system, it doesn't really learn anything new. There's some caveats. Synthetic data is quite strong right now, but for other reasons, I think. Like if you just think of like the information theory problem, there's no net new information being learned from synthetic data. That's actually probably debatable, but I don't think so. So at least knowing what data is being human generated and pushed into the next model update is quite
Mhm.
important. And you actually
Yeah.
don't see this from any of the big players. Like everyone's open source, but there's very few people that have talked about the data collection, how they cleaned it, the data transformation pipelines. That's still like the secret sauce to everyone.
And I
Mhm.
think the biggest challenge in that entire process, like the pipelining and the treatment of the data, are, I don't want to say trivial, but like they're, like you can get a general sense, right? Like data pipelines have been around for fucking forever, right? But I
I
think that
disagree.
the really tricky part in my view, want to get your thoughts on this, Brendan, is data quality. How do you ensure that, especially when it's user generated input, especially when it's like for the purpose of a model training, how do you ensure that an image, like let's say I'm collecting data from users of images of cats, and I make sure that the image that I'm collecting is a cat and not a building, right? I think
Yeah.
that's an interesting open problem. The example that is very objective, like image generation is a solved problem, but generally speaking, how do you ensure that the data that you're collecting is actually high quality data and not just some mumbo jumbo, whatever?
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part, right? Like I think it's funny because I think people think of like these AI systems as like a bunch of researchers spending their entire day building these like intricate models. The transformer architecture we have today that trains most of the LLMs that are on the market did not change that much since the original release. There's a couple like funky ways that we're making it a bit faster, more parallelized, but broadly speaking, the architecture did not change. So like the lines of code probably went up slightly, but the more of the juice in the squeeze has come from data pipeline, large amounts of data in tied with the ability to run that on hardware in a parallelized way. So I think like the difficulty is like a data collection system, transformation to your point of the cleaning, and then how do you take that huge lofty piece of data and run it through, 10,000 H100s in such a way that you can like produce a piece of output then you can run inference on. And it's an engineering problem, not a research problem broadly for most LLMs.
Or frankly, it could even be a social problem too. Like, how do you, especially the data quality piece, right? All the engineering aspects is definitely an engineering problem, but how can you engineer systems or data intake flows in which you use social engineering to keep people from submitting crap data? I think that's an
Yeah.
interesting problem space too that hasn't been
Mhm.
too explored yet.
Or
But
you can
okay,
have people, you could have people submitting data and people verifying the data that's submitted, right? So you just create like these loops of people, and I'm trying really hard to come up with as many jobs as I can, right? Because
Yeah.
uh, as we take away 10,000 jobs, like I'm trying to figure out if we can create 20, and
Where do you create the other 10?
yeah,
That's a good question.
checking the work
This
of the first 10. So almost like redundancy in the human system to give people something to do.
I think the times of humans working for a company, like W2 employee kind of thing, in which you work for the same company all the time, um, are ending, and that process will accelerate with AI. And it's crazy because like, sure, I'm not gonna work for a dedicated company. I'm gonna. It's like a lot of people have talked about this already with the creator economy and all that stuff, but this fundamentally changes the way that society works. Like society is built on like many aspects of society, from getting a mortgage to getting any type of loan, immigration. All of those work around having a dedicated employer for whom you show up every day, 40 hours a week, and you work for on a dedicated basis. And if that changes fundamentally, I think very much the entire labor market starts to change slowly over time um, at a global scale. Because if everybody becomes their own a small agent in the creator economy, and the way that you monetize is not necessarily by driving people or creating content. You could still be creating content, what have you, but it's mainly through interacting with some sort of model. um I think that changes the labor market fundamentally.
Yeah, there was a funny example of that. I was at a buffet the other day, not in the US, outside the US, and there were like these kids, there were like these 6, 7-year-old kids. They could barely reach the buffet line. Like they were like they weren't tall enough to reach the buffet line, but they were doing a review of the entire buffet line. They were on their TikTok, picking up the thing. Hey, look what's inside. Then they'd go to the next one, and I'm just like, what's happening? So I stopped them. I was like, hey, tell me what you're doing. And he's like, hey, my cousin makes money on TikTok doing this thing, and he's like 7 or 8 years old, and he's
Crazy.
already in like the creator economy. And it wasn't just that one kid. Like you could kind of sense that whether it was like talking about the location or talking about the food, like everybody was reviewing the restaurant, and the management didn't even know who was reviewing the restaurant. It was incredible. It was dozens of people that day in some form or another were reviewing that restaurant for the creator
That's
economy.
cool.
It was interesting.
You know,
Yeah.
it's interesting in a way. This converges into UBI, and I want to get your thoughts here on UBI generally. But as models begin to do more and more parts of the economy, and as humans, and as the role of humans becomes more about training these models, providing data, teaching these models how we do things, there is a future in which you get paid for everything. Like there's a future in which I have my Apple Watch and I opt in to say, hey, share all my data with a model and pay me for that data. Pay me for the data, which I think is a really important part of the puzzle, which is not happening right now. But pay me for the data that I'm producing. And at that point, every single human in the world becomes a beacon of data, getting paid for the data. And that's UBI. This converges back to UBI. It's not a good willingness of the government, but instead is a free market UBI where you are a valuable producer of data. This data is valuable in its own because it's used to train models, and now you're getting compensated for it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, because if the business model that comes out after, 30, 40 years of the internet revolution is, we will sell data to make money, we should kind of like I would be very I'm going to be very disappointed at that. Right? Like we did 40 years of innovation, we only came up with one business model, which was sell people's data to make money. And that kind of sucks, right? Like that'd be what our generation is known for, is like they could only come up with one way to monetize this. So I think you're right. I think there are other ways to incentivize and monetize this data and give the control back uh, to the people. And maybe that's why, some of the larger players are getting the responses they are getting from the markets. Maybe people are seeing that there's a paradigm shift happening and the same business models are not going to continue. Um, but they also then, I say that, but then I also think they have such a massive lead in terms of the data and the distribution that like can a new business model, a new version ever catch up? Because every time the new version collects 10 years of data, the old version has another 10 years of data lead potentially.
But I
I
think
think
if you go back to go ahead, Brendan. I've spoken enough. Go ahead.
the one thing I was going to say is like if you kind of, maybe this is not one to one mapping, but we've been selling data our entire kind of knowledge work profession. If you think of like the model as you, like you're the base model, and your data that you're selling is you
Mhm,
working at the company and like
mhm,
creating structure, producing
mhm,
output. That is you like contributing data to that like piece of work. I think it does
mhm,
typically fall down to into that. It's like who's the data producer, a model or a human, and then what is that rolling up into? And that feels like most companies kind of fall into this bucket of you're producing some sort of structure to an organization, and that is like what makes it valuable over time.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
but yeah, maybe not. We'll see.
At a fundamental level, that's just like Claude Shannon's information theory.
Yeah.
It's just who's doing the information transmitting here. Is it either you or is it a model? But Hamis, back to your comment here of like a paradigm shift. I think something exciting and interesting that's happening now is that data is ceasing to be so far. If you think about history or the digital age history and the role that data has played in that ecosystem, so far data has been valuable because data enabled you to get better insights on the people using your platform, which enabled you to serve better ads. Right? That was basically the reason why data was the new oil. I ran into an essay today. It was interesting. It was called data is the new soil as opposed to the new oil. Because as opposed to being a commodity that gets mined and mined and mined and used over and over again, like in the context of data for ad monetization,
Mm.
data is becoming a mean on its own. And you're starting to see data deals not for the end goal um, of training or of having better recommendation engines and serving better ads, but particularly for the model training, for the purpose of training models. And I think that's an interesting paradigm shift in which data is no longer a means to an end. Data is a commodity valuable on its own because it's the foundation of the AI era. And I think it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and so another question is, I almost feel like when you look across, like actually, the one of the things I wrote maybe a year ago or so is the same month that Microsoft let go of 10,000 people. They invested $10 billion into OpenAI, something like that. I can't remember the exact date, but it was like in the same month. And so I feel like uh, I feel like the two things are kind of happening together, where it was like this reckoning of just capital becoming more expensive, and so companies were starting to become more efficient, and it kind of coincided with this whole AI thing. And so the question I always ask myself is like, how much of this would have been happening? How much of this is happening is truly because of the advancement and capabilities of AI? How much of it is happening because capital is expensive and AI is advancing?
And
And how much of
hardware
this
is
is,
there.
yeah, right? And how much of it is happening because the perception is that it's advancing? But in a couple of years, the companies that kind of, went on these mass layoffs and like this tightening because of AI are going to underperform because the
Oh,
technology is just not there yet, right? And so I think about this all the time, is how much of this like actual signal and how much of it is just noise, um, because of other things.
Yeah, like what percentage of the economy can we say now AI goes to production in that share? So all call centers or all whatever stop, no more humans. It's all AI right now. And would it sustain the requirements of production? That's a really good point.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a really good point. Okay.
yeah.
So let's go back to the original question here to kind of like wrap up this discussion. Is this the last shift on the job market that we're gonna see, and then there's like a pre-AI world and a post-AI world, or is this similar to what the internet was, in which a lot of people said, "Yeah, this is gonna take away all the jobs," but it did take away all the jobs and created a lot of new ones. Where do you stand objectively on that line, and why? Is this the last one? Does it feel completely different, or is it the same as before, where new jobs are gonna get created?
I'll go first, maybe. The one thing I think we haven't seen yet in like AI is its mobile phone moment. So like the internet was big, everyone knew it was big. It was continuing to release, and then was it the 2010s where the mobile phone market, which is only possible because of the internet, blew up, and like that's the kind of thing that you just couldn't predict at the internet's onset that really made that thing hum, right? I think like a lot of people having the internet in their pocket is what makes the internet kind of just like magical. Their pocket, their wristwatch, their glasses, like whatever it exists now on like the 5G network. And I don't think we've figured out what that is for like the AI space. Like we know it's going to do all the knowledge work. That's pretty much just like a long game of integrations, APIs, data capture, robustness. But I don't think we found our like, oh wow, this is like the paradigm shift for the next layer. Maybe it's VR.
Hmm.
Maybe it's something. Maybe it's blockchain.
Yeah, but the transition is like such a heavy lift, right? Like if you like, how long did it take every business in the world to go from a paper set of services and prices to a digital version of the same thing? Right? It took decades. It took decades to go from paper to website. And how long does it take to go from website to API, right? Where everything's accessible through API. Now, while that transition happened, to this day, you have millions of web developers all around the world. And so now maybe you take another 20 years to have millions of API developers all around the world that connect this huge, every business in the world, but through an API. Like you should have an every like for example, we don't have an API, but we should in the direction that we're going, so that everybody can access it. Brendan's company is an AI company, but the website itself doesn't have an API connection, right? And so maybe what happens is that this transition integration for the next 20 years is such a massive and heavy lift that for the next 10, 20 years, like that's what we're busy with. Like we're busy making that transition because that's when every website in the world, every piece of data on the internet is accessible through API interfaces. That's when you've unlocked everything, at least digitally, right?
But like, I still think you reach that end state, and it's
Mhm.
still like not it. I mean,
Not there.
like you could be like the oracle that has every right answer because you've integrated everything, you know, all the things, but that doesn't mean it's like valuable because it doesn't do the thing. It doesn't
And
like
maybe the
physics.
next 10 years is like the action
Yeah,
integration, right? So how do you
yeah,
take every action in the world? Like how can you send a letter in the mail through an API? How can you pick up the trash with an API? Right? Like that's entire businesses, right? Where you hit the API and somebody picks up the trash, right? You can't really do
yeah,
that today. So basically, what we're saying then is there's a big focus on the reasoning part. We have to
yeah,
fix the context part, right? So we create an API for all the data in the world. So we fix the context.
yeah,
Reasoning, the models are getting better, but then you have the actions part, which also
yeah.
takes years and years to develop an API for everything, right? Like you could push every action in the world, whether it's even if you're incentivizing humans to do it, right? Like, what
Mhm.
if the world kind of looks like it was actually there was a movie with like this AI that would send messages to people and then threaten them
They
with
would physically
hurting
do
their
it.
family, and then they
Yeah,
would physically do it, right? But
Eagle Eye,
yeah, yes, Eagle Eye was the name. So
Shia
that would
LaBeouf.
be, yeah, that would be interesting, right? Where a computer says, I need a letter sent, and everyone who's around that post office gets a bid, right? Hey, we'll pay you $2 to go send that letter. And the first person that says, I'll accept the bid, like picks it up and actually does the work, right? And
Yeah.
so there's like this whole business of like creating
Yeah,
action
what is
out
that?
of the reasoning.
Task Rabbit.
And
It's like
so,
it's almost like a Task Rabbit Fiverr kind of
sure,
but instead of a human submitting the Task Rabbits, it's like the agent
yes.
AI being like, okay, I need a human for this. Let's
Mhm.
go
I have
go grab.
two comments for each of
Yeah.
you here. So first on your comment, James, about how long is it going to take? I actually think it's going to be a lot faster than a lot of people expect, because very few, like most people, assume that um, technological adoption continues to be a linear thing or increases linearly. And I think, like time and time again, has been shown that technological adoption is exponential. It took, say, I don't know, 100 years since the invention of the plane for everybody to fly in planes. It took 30 years for everybody to have a computer. It took 20 years for every business to have a website. It took 5 years for everybody to have a phone. I think it's going to take way less than we expect for literally AI to be part of everything. But now to my second point, which is, Brendan, when you were saying that AI hasn't had its oh shit moment yet, like the mobile era for the internet, I actually think that most transformative AI use cases are not B2C. I think most transformative AI use cases are B2B. And I don't
I
think
would
that was the
agree.
case for the internet.
Mhm.
The internet was a transformative B2C technology, which now the individual is supercharged. And I think AI is going to supercharge businesses first, and it may also continue to impact users. But I don't think I don't know how amazing it's going to be to have like your own personal Jarvis. Cool, very cool. But I think it really moves the needle that some technologies apply for multiple businesses that are moving millions of dollars of value.
You don't
So
think?
that's
Isn't that wasn't that what mobile did?
yeah, no,
Brought the internet into your pocket, and
I
we're just
think it's
saying, yeah,
I think it's really valuable. I think it's valuable for the individual, but I think the real driver is going to be on the B2C side.
B two B
Sorry,
B two C.
B2B,
Yeah,
the B2C.
I would agree with that because I think the improvement like the efficiency increase or the access increase and all those things, like we're pretty good on those already. Like you can find the answer to whatever you're looking for already, but businesses are far behind on that adoption and have so much more inefficiency built in, and frankly like struggling so much more, that they will be the first ones where the big use cases that you get paid more than $10 for anyway are in the enterprises, and right, they're the ones who you will save millions of dollars for, so you can charge hundreds of thousands of dollars for that service. In the retail individual world, what are you going to charge for a Jarvis? Like $20 a month?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
the
I just think
value.
it proliferates faster though in B2C. Like it
Yeah,
can't.
okay.
There's just like a organizational, you know, motion that B2B is always going to have, which is like not related to AI. It's just it'll always exist. And I think that's why it's like there'll be valuable companies coming out of B2B, which is like what we're doing. I think
Mhm.
B2C just has the hockey stick exponential. Once you have some AI that is on your Ray-Bans and really just works, it just flies.
Mhm.
Um, in that,
I
yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
like if ChatGPT was released as a B2B solution, would it have gotten 100 million users in whatever,
and
one and a
they're
half
Yeah,
months?
no.
struggling right now with their enterprise offering of ChatGPT for other
Mhm.
reasons too, probably. But like they're
Yeah.
trying to do
Because
enterprise
when I
right now, and they
speak
found
to
it's
any
hard.
like serious enterprise, they've blocked ChatGPT. They don't allow
Yep.
the team members to use it. So that's an
Okay,
interesting point,
Hamis,
right? Yeah.
your take here on like the original question of what's happening with the job market. Is this a last wave, or is this just like any other previous technologies in which more jobs are going to get created indefinitely, which is annoying?
I think the integrations are going to take forever. I think, yeah, I think the really where we've made most of the stride is on the reasoning part. But the context and actually the part that's a completely, I feel, not built out is the action part. Brendan talks about it all the time. I feel like there's just like years and years and years of like slowly chipping away at everything that can be an action for the
Yeah.
agent. And so I think it takes forever. And just like imagine the the complexity of solving that, not in one country, not in one region, like solving it everywhere for every use case, right? It's just incredibly complex. And I don't think AI like speeds that up really very much. And so I think we will, the same way that even the website technology has been there forever, Wix has been there forever. Every business in the world, every person in the world does not have a website. That we're not there yet, even after what 20 years of these tools being readily available. Um, and so, sure, it'll be faster, but that integration is going to be such a long process. So, my take is that I do feel right now that it's a mixture of like Facebook, Google, Microsoft had overhired probably, and now they're kind of just reacting back to that. Um, sure, there's some of that is coming from actual productivity increases, but I think a lot of that is just come from free money not being free anymore. And so I think people are like reading too much into it on like how effective that will be. I think there's going to be these phases where we'll get a little ahead of the curve, right? And then we'll kind of take a step back, be like, okay, we're not there yet. And then we'll start hiring people again. And then we'll get a little ahead on that side. And then we'll go back. I think we'll go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth till we like really find the medium that works. So I don't think the impact is like the
Immediate.
actual impact is immediate. I think I'm seeing a lot of CTOs kind of like pause everything to kind of take a breather, but I think when they come out in the other side in 3 months, 6 months, when capital is like readily available again, they'll say, okay, we're not there yet. Like I need to ship the product. I need to get the job done. Like, and if I overextend myself for the next 2 years, it's like whatever, at least like get the job done. So I think it is I think we have overshot in a lot of companies. I think it is a little bit like, oh, this is suddenly overnight going to solve all of our problems, and it won't. And then they'll go back a little bit, then they'll come back, they'll go back, they'll come back, and then they'll find the perfect combination of human and agents that gets the job done.
So here's my final take here, and then we can wrap after this. I think the short term is exactly what Hamid said. It's going to slowly chip away at digital knowledge workers, from blog posters, copywriters, graphic designers, even developers at some point too. Slowly, that chipping away is going to continue to happen. I think the moment that you bridge into the real world and you actually start building competent agents in the real world that don't necessarily have to look like humanoids, it can be literally anything. I think at that point, things converge towards UBI, and it's the last cycle. I think the short term is slowly chipping away, and once again you have agents in the real world, there's no more jobs. Eventually, everything is going to be done by machines. Everything is fully automated, um, and through whatever role humans start playing in that AI world, that's going to be where the UBI is going to be coming from, and that can be extremely dystopian or extremely utopian. And I think it depends on one and only one thing: is who owns and who is accruing the value of the models that are literally running the world. If it is a single entity or a handful of entities, we're all fucked. If the value is distributing somewhat fairly to individuals, I think we have utopia. And that's I guess
But
a
it
feature that
won't,
I want to fight
right?
for.
I don't think it ever has, and I don't think it will. I think a lot of the crypto crowd thinks because it's the right thing to do or the ideal thing to do that it will happen that way. But when has the world functioned that way,
Yeah.
I mean,
right?
I don't think it's too far. Like I don't think it's too far from what we have now in value on the web accrues, but I think that's a maybe a next episode
That's
story.
the next week.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
next week story.
What
good
do you think,
stuff. Good
Brendan?
stuff.
Yeah.
I think it'll
All right,
probably
folks.
happen similar to the Industrial Revolution. There was machines back then. Everyone thought that was going to take everyone's job, and it did for some jobs. But then we found new ones.
Mhm.
Yeah,
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll
love
see.
it.
Yeah,
I think the last
I
cycle
think
holds.
when it comes down to it, right, like businesses will realize that, they can either, yeah, I'm seeing it live. Like I'm really like seeing the experiments live, and I'm seeing it with like big companies, small companies. Is that there's this moment of, oh my God, I have to pause everything and figure this out, and there's an underwhelming,
Response.
realization on the other side. So it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, it kind of gets it done, but we're not really there yet, and then they go back to like business as usual. They don't. It doesn't go to medium in the middle somewhere. It's like, oh, just I need to ship the product. The customer's screaming, and down my throat. And so I think the urgency to deliver, the urgency to get results, all of those things kind of get in the way of us having like very long-term thinking. You can see what's happening with Meta's stock, right? $250 billion of market cap wiped out in one day, largest wipeout ever. And it's because they're talking about all the investments they're making in AI, and people are like, "Oh, does it make money?" And that's how people think, right? And think about how well positioned Meta is, right? Because in our opinion, there's only two things that matter: it's data and distribution, and Meta has both of those things. It's like really well positioned, but investors don't want to wait 10 years to monetize something. They want to squeeze every dime out today.
And that's why we need diverse discourse and not just investors running this world. But okay, let's
Good
wrap
stuff.
here, folks. Thank you for such a fantastic discussion. I hope it was valuable also for listeners. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with some other spicy hot takes on some other crazy topic about the future of
Mhm.
humanity. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you.